Hey folks, welcome to the Ramble. I want to talk about two things that are important to me, and those two things are pro wrestling and equality, and specifically women's equality for this instance. I have been a wrestling fan for my entire life. The number one wrestling company in the world, and certainly the number one wrestling company in the United States and North America and Western civilization in general, is World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE. About 3 years ago, WWE decided to change the way that it presented its women's wrestlers. Women's wrestling has been a consistent part of WWE's wrestling product since the late 90s. And before that, it was sort of irregularly featured. Every few years, it seemed like they would reinstate a women's championship and start putting women on the show. But it wasn't consistently part of the show until the late 90s, and it has been ever since. But up until a few years ago, it was always featured as kind of a sideshow, like an added attraction. And here are the girls, the amazing wrestling women. And they would be put in dead spots in major shows after there was a really big, hot match. They would put on a women's match to cool the crowd down, or to give people a chance to go to the concession stand or go to the bathroom and sort of relax until the next big match featuring the men. And about 3 years ago, they made a very conscious, very public decision to start featuring women's wrestling in a way that was more on par with the way the men were being featured, and to stop featuring them as sideshows, and to stop featuring them as just sort of sex objects, and to focus on them as athletes and as wrestlers, and to present them and give them storylines and matches that were more like how the men were being presented. And they called it the Divas Revolution, because unfortunately diva had come to be their euphemism for women wrestlers. That was sort of the nickname. The men were superstars and the women were divas. And they dropped that diva branding after a few months, and now they just call them women wrestlers. Imagine that. And the Divas Revolution is now referred to as the Women's Revolution. And WWE has promoted its rebranding of its women's division and its altered presentation of its women's division to be more legitimate and more on par with the men very, very prominently, to the point that earlier this year, they signed to a long-term contract former UFC Women's Champion Ronda Rousey, who was one of the biggest pay-per-view draws that UFC ever had. Now she's transitioning from mixed martial arts to professional wrestling, and she's being featured as one of the top stars in WWE. She's being promoted as one of their headliners, and that only makes sense because they've obviously invested a lot of money in her contract, and she's a big, major mainstream star, and they want to put her out front. That makes sense, and it goes along with their narrative of, hey, we take women's wrestling seriously now, and gender equality matters to us, and our women wrestlers are role models to all the young women in the audience, and we want to give the young women heroes to look up to, and this is really important to us. This is something that we are really getting behind, and it reflects our philosophy as a company and our priorities as promoters and storytellers. And so now that I've established that, let me also tell you that later this week, this Friday in fact, the same day that the new Avengers movie opens, WWE is holding a major event in Saudi Arabia, in the big new soccer stadium in Saudi Arabia. And it's called the Greatest Royal Rumble. And it's being promoted as a major, major live event in Saudi Arabia. There will be a massive attendance. Tens and tens of thousands of people will be there live at the event, I'm quite sure. And it's also being broadcast on the WWE network. So people here in the United States and all over the world, whoever gets the WWE network will be able to watch it as well. And it's a stacked card. If you're a fan of WWE, all of the big stars are on the show. There's a steel cage match between Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns for the Universal title. There's a WrestleMania rematch between AJ Styles and Shinsuke Nakamura for the WWE title. There's a tournament final to crown new Raw Tag Team Champions. And there is, of course, the Greatest Royal Rumble, which is a Royal Rumble with 50 people participating. Usually the Royal Rumble only has 30 people participating. This one has 50, so it's the Greatest Royal Rumble. But one thing you'll notice, if you run down the card of the greatest Royal Rumble. Look at all the matches. Look at all the people who are booked. No women. Not a single woman will appear on the show. In fact, I don't even know if the women are making the trip. I doubt very much that the women are even making the trip to Saudi Arabia for this show. They're staying home, or they're staying elsewhere for that show. And the reason for that is that women, for the most part, are still extremely marginalized and oppressed in Saudi Arabian society. The Saudi government imposes quite strict restrictions on people based on gender and enforces very traditional gender roles. And they just don't like the idea of having women on the show. So WWE, when the Saudi royal family presumably backed up several Brinks trucks full of money to Vince McMahon's house and said, we would like to sign a long-term deal to run events of WWE in Saudi Arabia, and one of our conditions is don't book any women on the show. Vince McMahon and his other executives, I'm sure, said, okay, you got a deal. They saw the money and they said, oh, great, perfect. Yeah, no women, gotcha. Money talks and bullshit walks, and actually money talks and pretty much everything else walks. And it shouldn't be a terrible surprise to anyone that WWE's so-called commitment to gender equality and to promoting its women's division and its women wrestlers with respect and with equality and with dignity and treating them the same as the men, it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that that all turned out to just be hollow rhetoric. That they actually don't mean any of that. That they will be happy to promote gender equality on their show right up to the point that it becomes more profitable for them to not do that. That shouldn't surprise anyone, especially anyone who has paid any tiny amount of attention to WWE or to the people who run it since pretty much ever, right? So it's not surprising. But what I did notice this time is how well this situation illustrates the amount of overlap between how WWE's commitment to gender equality is ultimately just false, and the same thing about the Saudi government. Because the exclusion of women from the WWE show in Saudi Arabia takes place against the backdrop of several years of liberalization of treatment of women in Saudi Arabia. Women, of course, have been historically very, very strictly oppressed in Saudi society. There is nothing approaching gender equality in most areas of Saudi society. In the most recent World Economic Forum Global Gender Equality Report, Saudi Arabia was ranked 138 out of 144 countries ranked in terms of gender equality. So right near the bottom, right? The United States, for comparison, was, I think, 49. So we have some some distance to climb as well, but not quite as much as Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is down near the bottom in terms of gender equality. Women were afforded the right to vote in local elections about 7 years ago, and around that same time they also began to be appointed to the Consultative Assembly of Saudi Arabia, which is the closest equivalent that Saudi Arabia has to a legislative body, to a parliament. It's not a legislative body because Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy and only the king gets to actually make laws, but the Consultative Assembly gets to suggest laws to the king, gets to make recommendations, gets to advise the king as to what the proper course of action should be, or what things need to be addressed. But it doesn't ultimately have very much power. It's all still finally up to the king in Saudi Arabia. And a few years ago, the king decided it would be a good idea to appoint some women to the Consultative Assembly, and he began doing that. And now there are actually, in terms of percentage, there's the same number of percentage of women in Saudi Arabia's Consultative Assembly as there are women in the United States Congress. So there have been some changes. And a couple of years ago, there was also much made about the fact that now women are allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. And there have been other sort of loosening of restrictions so that women are free to do more without being chaperoned by a man or having to seek the permission of a man. And these are positive steps forward. But as with the WWE's so-called commitment to gender equality, you can't get past the fact that despite these more liberal policies, and despite these steps forward in gender equality that have been taken in Saudi Arabia over the last few years, after many years of very, very harsh gender inequality, you can't shake the feeling that this is all just performative. That the Saudis, the Saudi royal family, is very aware of how poorly its record on human rights is viewed by much of the rest of the world, and particularly its treatment of women is looked down upon and is cited as a reason why Saudi Arabia should not be sort of afforded a seat at the table with the rest of the world leaders, should not be treated as an ally or as a positive force in the world. That even though it is very wealthy and very influential, and there are many strategic and political reasons why other countries would want to make an ally of Saudi Arabia, there are lots of other reasons why you might want to keep them at arm's length or try to pressure them into changing things within their society, because it is such an unequal society, because it is an absolute monarchy, because it is a very authoritarian, strict, closed society. The Saudis are aware of this. They're aware that this is the perception of their country from the outside. They're aware that people in the global community are very concerned about these issues within their country, so they take steps to make it look like they're addressing these problems. They say, oh, you think we need to have more women's equality in Saudi Arabia? Okay, well, we'll do this, and we'll do this, and we'll do this, and we'll do this, and there you go. Look, they can vote. Look, we're appointing them to our equivalent of parliament. Look, they can even drive. Come on, we're doing a good job, right? Just get off our backs. Women in Saudi Arabia are doing just fine. Look at all the rights they have now, right? That's the product that is being sold by Saudi Arabia at this point, even though the underlying systems and the underlying inequalities that are truly responsible for the oppression of women in Saudi Arabia are still in place, and it is still a literal patriarchy. Here in America, we have sort of a social, cultural patriarchy where it's not explicit, it's not enshrined in law that men run the show, but for all practical purposes, men still run the show. In Saudi Arabia, it's officially that way. It's officially a patriarchy. There is a king who is in charge of everybody. Men still hold the vast majority of political offices and still hold almost all of the actual political power in their hands. And men are still very much in the superior position in terms of society and social standing, despite allowances that have been made to allow women to close the gap just a tiny little bit. So Saudi Arabia has done the same thing that WWE has done, which is to try and give the impression that they are moving towards gender equality without actually doing anything to change the fundamental causes of the gender equality in the first place. And when I compare the two, I just want to stress, because people always sort of go to this place when you draw a comparison between two things. I'm not at all suggesting that the plight of women in WWE is the same as the plight of women in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, there's a major difference. Obviously, these two things are not the same. The oppression and the marginalization and all the other restrictions placed on women in Saudi society are in a completely different world than the way women are promoted in a wrestling company. I'm not trying to say that they're the same at all. But the attitudes of the powers that be in both WWE and Saudi Arabia, I think, are very, very similar in terms of how they say they feel about women's equality and what they have actually done, or what their actions demonstrate their real values and their real goals to be. And these two things are coming together with this Greatest Royal Rumble show, because even though there are no women booked on the show, and none of the fans in attendance at the soccer stadium to see the show will see any women in the ring plying their trade, wrestling, there will be women in the audience. That's another change that was made a few years ago. They decided that it should be allowable for women to attend soccer matches, because that wasn't allowed until a few years ago. Now women can attend soccer matches in Saudi Arabia. They have to be brought in with a chaperone. They have to come with their husbands. They can't just, single women can't just go buy tickets to watch a soccer match, because that would be chaos. That would be anarchy. We can't allow that. So the Saudis are allowing women to attend the WWE show. And in fact, seats in the lower bowl of the stadium, the seats that will be the closest to the ring, are only being sold, according to Dave Meltzer, who is a wrestling journalist, if you don't know who I'm talking about. Seats in the lower bowl of the stadium are only being sold to married couples. And in Saudi Arabia, there is only opposite sex marriage. So married couple means man and woman, husband and wife. They are the only people who are allowed to buy seats in the lower bowl, which means that when people tune in on TV to see the show in Saudi Arabia or in the United States or wherever, they will see women in the audience. They will see women sitting in the audience enjoying the show. And that will perhaps give the impression that Saudi society is possessed of much more gender equality than it truly has. Unfortunately, just as with WWE's women's revolution, the liberalization of gender policies in Saudi Arabia is, for the most part, just performative. It's just for show. And that doesn't discount the changes that have been made, because 20% of women serving in the equivalent of parliament is not nothing. That is progress. That is a step forward. Women being allowed to attend soccer matches when previously they were not allowed at all, that is progress. That is a step forward. Women having better education and better healthcare outcomes, that's nice. That's good. That's not nothing. But it doesn't address the underlying problem. And it doesn't mean that gender inequality in Saudi Arabia is a thing of the past, or even that the powers that be in Saudi Arabia care about making it a thing of the past anytime soon, because I don't think there's evidence that they really do. I think they're committed to this performative commitment to gender equality, just as the executives, the powers that be in WWE are committed to pretending to care about women's wrestling and women's equality in their product. But there's very little, if any, evidence that they truly see this as important, that they actually care about the plight of women in their country, that they actually care about making women into a more empowered part of their population, that they actually care about reaching for and perhaps even someday attaining something like gender equality in their society. I don't think that they really do. I think they're doing it for the international political equivalent of public relations, which is the same reason that WWE does almost anything progressive or humane or ethical. Vince McMahon has said so himself many times. Vince McMahon has said that the only reason WWE has a wellness policy where they test their athletes for steroids and for performance-enhancing drugs and for illegal drugs, the only reason they have that policy at all is public relations. Vince McMahon has said that. He has admitted openly. The only reason they do anything good for their athletes, or in terms of bringing their product more in line with progressive social attitudes, is for public relations, is to make the company look good. Not because they care, not because they're making any real changes, because they just want the company to look good. And I fear, and I suspect, and I think that the same thing is true of Saudi Arabia. It is still an absolute monarchy, and particularly women are still kept very much under the thumb of men. And the fact that they're going to be able to attend a WWE show, and the fact that they can drive, and the fact that they can vote in local elections, that's great. That's good. That's progress. Congratulations. But that is not real substantive change of the type that needs to happen. So in a way, in this issue, when it comes to their attitudes toward gender inequality and their extremely superficial and ultimately meaningless commitment to achieving gender equality, WWE and Saudi Arabia have a lot in common. It's actually perfectly reasonable that they would have signed a deal, as they recently did, to have WWE continue to promote events in Saudi Arabia over the next 10 years. Because in this case, they are an ideal tag team.